The appointment of an annual Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Scholar in Holocaust Studies began in 1990 when the third president of Stockton, Dr. Vera King Farris, created the chair in honor of her mother. I remember well the story that Dr. Farris told each year about her mother, a hardworking, resilient woman with limited opportunity for education who worked as a cleaning person at a local high school. The only time she ever saw her mother cry was when she learned of the Holocaust. Under Dr. Farris's strong and inspirational leadership, Stockton's Holocaust Resource Center was created and continues today with a national and international reputation for its work. This lecture is presented annually around the anniversary of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass that occurred on the evening of November 9th to 10th, 1938. In the words of historian Max Reen, Kristallnacht came and everything changed. Jewish shops, homes, schools, synagogues, and hospitals were attacked. Books were burned, thousands of Jews were arrested. It was the beginning, but it was not the end. Over 70 years later, we are still trying to make sense of a world where this could occur. Our speaker this evening, and our Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Scholar in Holocaust Studies for this academic year, is Dr. Elizabeth Baer. Dr. Baer also held this chair at Stockton in 2004, and we are very fortunate to have her return. She is also a research professor of English and African Studies at the Gustavus Adolphus College in St. Peter, Minnesota. Dr. Baer has published widely on women's literature and Holocaust fiction and memoirs. Her first book, Shadows on My Heart, the Civil War Diary of Lucy Buck of Virginia, published by the University of Georgia Press in 1997, was nominated for the Lincoln Prize. Her second book, The Blessed Abyss, inmate number 6582 in Ravensbrück concentration camp for women, co-edited with Hester Baer, is a critical edition of a memoir originally published in Germany in 1946. She received a Fulbright Award to study the history of Jews in Germany and was the recipient of the Virginia Hamilton Prize for the best essay on multicultural children's literature. Dr. Baer co-edited with Dr. Myrna Goldenberg, Experience and Expression, Women, the Nazis and the Holocaust, an anthology of essays on gender in the Holocaust. Her most recent book, The Golem Redux, From Prague to Post-Holocaust Fiction, traces the intertextual appropriation of the Golem legend in contemporary Jewish American fiction, graphic novels, comics, the X-Files, and films. The National Award of Merit was given to Dr. Baer by the American Association of State and Local Historians in recognition of the exhibit created by students in her class commemorating controversy on the Dakota-US War of 1862. Her new monograph, forthcoming from Wayne State University Press in 2017, is entitled The Genocidal Gaze from German Southwest Africa to the Third Reich. As I reviewed Dr. Baer's curriculum vitae in preparation for this introduction, which I might add is an extremely impressive resume, a common thread struck me. Dr. Baer has always concerned herself in some way with human rights issues, whether the topic is women's studies, the study of American Indians, African studies, the Holocaust, genocide prevention studies, interfaith understanding, social justice, children's literature, or ethics. Her career has been devoted to examining history to help people understand people. Dr. Baer's lecture this evening is entitled The Origins of the Holocaust in Africa, the German Genocide of 1904 to 1907. Many links have been made between the behavior of the German imperialists in Africa and the Holocaust perpetuated by the Nazis 30 years later. I believe you will very much enjoy hearing Dr. Baer lecture about this little-known but tragic piece of early 20th century history. You've all been given 3x5 cards. If you have a question for Dr. Baer, she will take them at the end of the lecture. And I'm also happy to announce that her books are for sale outside this lecture hall at the end of the lecture. Would you please join me now in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Baer.
Thanks so much. Good evening. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight to commemorate the event of Kristallnacht, November 9th and 10th, 1938. I would also like to extend special thanks to Alyssa von Joden-Forgy, the director of the Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Gail Rosenthal and Sarah Albertson at the Holocaust Resource Center, Dean Rob Gregg, Susan Lang for that very generous introduction, and Jeff Topping, who has been enormously helpful to me with the technology for my presentation this evening. I expect that my title, The Origins of the Holocaust in Africa, the German Genocide of 1904 to 1907, may have baffled some of you in the audience. I have been writing the book from which tonight's lecture is drawn for the past 5 years, and when I tell people about the subject of the book, they often respond they had no idea that Germany had committed a genocide in Africa at the dawn of the 20th century. Instead, most people mark the beginning of the Holocaust with the November pogrom, or Kristallnacht as the Germans called it, as the true beginning of the Holocaust. Indeed, many fine historians of the Holocaust have done the same. On the Holocaust Museum in Washington's website, for example, it is stated significantly, Kristallnacht marks the first instance in which the Nazi regime incarcerated Jews on a massive scale simply on the basis of their ethnicity. The Nazi regime expanded and radicalized measures aimed at removing Jews entirely from German economic and social life in the forthcoming years. Thus, Kristallnacht figures as an essential turning point in Nazi Germany's prosecution of Jews, which culminated in the attempt to annihilate the European Jews. And these are some familiar images of Kristallnacht, the broken glass windows, which give the night its name in Nazi parlance, the burning synagogues. I thought you might be interested to see this headline from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and a group of Jews who are being marched to a concentration camp in Germany. The statistics are grim. 30,000 Jews, mostly men, were arrested and put in concentration camps that night. Over 100 were killed, and over 1,000 synagogues were set on fire. 7,000 Jewish businesses were damaged or destroyed, and the experience that women had of Kristallnacht was one of feathers flying down because Nazis broke freely into apartments owned by Jewish families, helped themselves to silver and porcelain and china, and ripped open pillows in order to see if something was hidden in them. But in the past decade, new insights on German colonialism and its relationship with the Holocaust have emerged, and historians have begun to recognize and write about a much earlier genocide, which may in fact be the true origin of the Holocaust. If we closely examine how German imperialists proceeded in their treatment of indigenous people in Africa, we will quickly see the parallels between their treatment and that of the victims of the Holocaust. Neither I, and this is a really important point, nor other scholars claim that this genocide in Africa was the cause of the Nazi Holocaust. That's not what my presentation is about. Rather, what I'll be looking at is the methodology and ideology that were used by the Germans in Africa and how those transferred to the fatherland and were implemented 30 years later when Hitler came to power. Precisely because this history is so new to so many, I will begin at the beginning and use some images to help you learn this history. So, Holocaust studies, which is said to have begun in 1961 with the publishing of Raoul Hilberg's 2-volume history, focused very appropriately initially on the victims. And then the focus moved to perpetrators, not exclusively, of course. You could say that the focus widened. In the 1990s, Holocaust studies embraced the inclusion of gender as part of the way to understand both the experience of victims and the ideology of the perpetrators. Then a further expansion of the field to include genocide studies, to begin to look at connections between the Nazi Holocaust and genocides that had occurred elsewhere before and since. And finally, an intersection between Holocaust and genocide studies and post-colonial studies. And my presentation tonight is at that intersection. In 1885, the Germans held a conference in Berlin to which many European leaders were invited. They spread out a big African map on a conference table and literally divided up the continent, deciding which sections of Africa would go to France, Portugal, Italy, Germany, England. And here's a map of Africa, and if I can work this little pointer, I'm not sure I know how to do that actually. But the country I'll be talking about is that yellow country to the left of South Africa, so just near the tip of the continent, and it's labeled German Southwest Africa on the map. That was Germany's colony where the genocide occurred. And this is how the continent looked divided up after the Berlin Conference. European imperialism was an important factor in the creation of connections between imperialism or colonialism and genocide because it sanctioned hierarchies of all kinds, it sanctioned racism, and colonies in general had no rule of law when it came to treatment of the colonized people. And this gave the imperialists a great deal of freedom in how they treated the colonized people. The image you see is one of Cecil Rhodes, a British man who made a fortune in diamonds in South Africa and then bought a country for himself, which he named Rhodesia. It is now called Zimbabwe. German colonialism lasted a relatively short time compared to places like England and Portugal. The Germans arrived in German Southwest Africa in 1884, but it was a private citizen who began there prospecting along the coast. In 1885, then the Germans as a country took responsibility for this section of the continent. And 1919 was the end of German colonialism because Germany lost World War I, and in that loss they were forced to give up their communities. The two indigenous groups that I'll be talking about this evening are Herero and the Nama, two dominant indigenous groups in German Southwest Africa. And I want to begin by sharing with you a few images of what German colonialism looked like. This is a photograph from a memoir by a woman named Marguerite von Eckenbrecher. And the memoir is called Africa, What It Gave Me and What It Took From Me. She was a settler in the colony, and she is living quite a comfortable life, as you can see, and she has appropriated an indigenous woman to be her servant. Since I'm an avid knitter, this is one of my favorite photographs from German Southwest Africa. These are three German soldiers amusing themselves with knitting. It appears that the terrace under them has been created with beer cans, which is maybe not surprising given German love of beer. But the next slide shows you a somewhat more frightening image of pastimes that the Germans undertook as soldiers in their colony. Not only does this picture suggest that they were hunters of various wildlife in Namibia, but the skull posed right in the center is chilling evidence of the attitude of German colonists toward the indigenous people, that they were on a par with beasts. They were considered as subhuman, as having no history, no civilization, no religion, and therefore they could be exterminated in the way that animals were. German soldiers availed themselves of indigenous women. There was widespread rape in the colony, and there were also consenting relationships. We don't know much about this photograph. You can draw your own conclusions. This one is a little bit more explicit. One of the things about this photograph that I find somewhat shocking is the German man has images of white women on the wall, but he has a black woman in bed with him. In 1905, Germany decided they did not want to have to claim as citizens the offspring of these mixed relationships, and so they forbade German soldiers from having sexual relationships with indigenous women in their colony, which is a chilling precursor of the Nuremberg laws that made a similar kind of law. Historians, including Sebastian Conrad, who's named at the bottom of the slide, have talked about the ways in which German colonialism was unique. There was a much higher degree of racial segregation. As I mentioned, intermarriage was forbidden. The violence of colonial wars was often much more vicious, and genocidal strategies were used. And finally, the colonial policy was built upon a so-called scientific approach, which from the sound of it might seem appealing, but in fact what it meant is that the Germans were conducting medical experiments on the indigenous people. Again, a kind of precursor to what we'll see with Joseph Mengele and others in the Holocaust. The first governor who was sent out from Germany to their colony in Africa was a man by the name of Heinrich Göring, G-O-R-I-N-G. And if that name sounds familiar to you, you're right. He was the father of Hermann Göring, who becomes one of the very early Nazis in the 1920s. He becomes one of Hitler's henchmen. He founds the SS. And he also directs the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, during World War II. Hermann learned the lessons of racial hierarchy and the acceptance of exterminating people perceived as less than human at the knees of his father. His father liked to dress him up in an outfit of colonial soldiers. And so it's one small thread of many that tell us how the ideology from the colonies was transferred to Germany and embraced by the populace. From 1894 to 1904, a man by the name of Theodor Lütwein was the governor of German Southwest Africa. He followed a policy of colonialism without bloodshed. He tried to be diplomatic. He did use military coercion, and he also tried divide and rule, which is to say he tried to divide indigenous groups and set them against one another. And what he peddled were so-called protection treaties, which he tried to get indigenous groups to sign, claiming that then the Germans would protect them against other indigenous groups. But in fact, what the Germans did once they had these protection treaties in place was to move in and take the best land, steal cattle, and make life untenable for the indigenous group. Lütwein was followed by Lothar von Trotha, who was governor from 1904 to 1905. He was appointed by the Germans back in Berlin because he had been a successful soldier in the Boxer Rebellion in China and in other wars with indigenous people in Africa. And the Germans felt comfortable that he was going to settle all of the disagreements and the resistance that existed among the indigenous people. He issued an extermination order which read, "I will destroy the African tribes with streams of blood and streams of money. Only following this cleansing can something new emerge which will remain. And here he's using an early version of a term we use now, ethnic cleansing. He literally meant to cleanse the land of the indigenous people so that German settlers could have the land and everything on it. The something new that would emerge would be a new Germany, a colony for settlers. This is an image now, so we've seen some images of the German settlers. Now I'd like to share some images of the indigenous people with you. This is a family of Bushmen, an image which gives you a sense of the normalcy of the people that the Germans were colonizing, family grouping. By August of 1904, the Germans were really getting tired of the quarreling and the resistance put up by the indigenous people, the occasional military engagements between the groups. And so they planned to fight what they trusted would be the final battle against the indigenous people. And it was held in a mountain where water was available, called appropriately the Waterberg. 5,000 Herero were gathered on the mountain. Entire families were there. They expected that they were going to engage in diplomacy, as they had been doing so with Luitwein for a decade. They didn't know this new man, von Trotta. They weren't aware of the extermination that was going to come. Von Trotta set up his battle plan such that there was a pincher movement. It meant that the Germans would be squeezing the Herero into only one exit available to them, and that was into the Omaheki Desert. By 1905, 80,000 Herero had been reduced to 15,000. And so this meets all the criteria that the UN set up for genocide, although of course that would come 50 years later. In October 1904, another indigenous group, seeing what had happened to the Herero, decided that they would rebel. Instead of doing a frontal battle as the Herero had done, which decimated that group, the Nama decided to fight a guerrilla war. Nonetheless, over a 3-year period, 50% of that group were killed, and so this constituted the first genocide of the 20th century. In the aftermath, concentration camps were set up for forced labor. Concentration camps had been used before. Some people could argue that the reservations this country put Native Americans on were a kind of concentration camp. The British had used concentration camps in the Boer War. But the difference with the German concentration camps was the rate of death. Not only in the concentration camps because of poor diet and forced labor, but the Germans also set up a death camp. And this distinction between concentration camps, which were largely labor camps or re-education camps, continues into the Holocaust. The death camps are places like Auschwitz, Sobibor, and so forth. So that distinction between those two kinds of camps is created in this colony. The mortality rate at Shark Island was 80%. Rape, disease, overwork, starvation, and medical experiments. This is an image of a group of indigenous people who somehow survived in the Omaheki Desert, though the Germans had poisoned the water holes and there was very little to eat. And you can see that they're starving. The missionaries and the military encouraged them to come in from the desert, and they came to volunteer to build a railroad for the Germans so that they could eat. This is how the Germans treated many of the forced laborers. They wore chains around their neck, around their hands, and in many cases, whether they worked on the railroad or for individual farmers on plantations, they were made to wear these chains 24 hours a day. And the Germans summarily hung any indigenous person who put up resistance. Women in the forced labor camps were made to do the soldiers' laundry and to serve as sex slaves. So what are some of the links between colonial genocide and the Holocaust? Historians have begun to trace the ways in which ideology and strategy employed in Namibia, which is what we call this area of Africa today, and these were then replicated in the Nazi Holocaust just 30 years later. And Zimmerer and Gewald are two of the historians who began to put this pattern together about a decade ago. A scholar in California who's just published a very interesting book on Native Americans named Benjamin Madley has also drawn these kinds of links. The concept of Lebensraum, the German desire for more living space, is not an invention at the time of the Holocaust, but rather in 1897 by a man named Ratzel at the height of the colonial wars. The notion of racial hierarchy that I have talked about already was socialized in Germany. It was debated in the Reichstag for sure, but the idea that these Africans were subhuman and could be exterminated was gaining acceptance. And then that idea is transferred to Jews, to the disabled, to gay and lesbian people, to all the people who were victims of the Nazis. The notion of Rassenschande, racial shame, sleeping with a person of another race, producing mixed-race children, begins in Namibia. The idea of Endlösung, a final solution which will cleanse the land and make it available to Germans, also begins in the colony. And as I've already mentioned, Konzentrationslager and death camps begin in Namibia. Personal connections include not only Göring, which I've already talked about, but a man named Eugen Fischer. He was in the colony doing medical experiments in German Southwest Africa, and he then went back to Germany and is one of the people who taught Joseph Mengele the business of eugenics. This is an image, and it's an old blurry photograph, but it's an image of Shark Island. The layer of white that you see in the middle is actually tents in which the people were put up. This island was located on a very cold, windy coast, off the coast of Namibia, and some of the people who were incarcerated there are in the foreground. An image of a person on the right who is starving in one of these camps, and on the left, a voyeuristic German who really loved taking pictures of indigenous women without clothing. And he would often rip the blouses of women off before the photographer took the picture so that their breasts would be exposed. The heads of prisoners who had died were removed at Shark Island and sent to Germany. Sometimes they were sent in this condition. Other times, the indigenous women themselves were forced to peel back the skin from the skull with shards of glass before the skulls were shipped. The Germans made postcards from the collections of skulls. Not until 2011 were the skulls returned to Namibia. Shark Island is advertised as a tourist site today. And this quote at the bottom of this slide comes from a tourist website on my computer. And this, despite the fact that many of the skeletons have drifted up because it's all sand, people ride their ATVs over the land on this island. I'd like to talk a little bit about memory and memorialization in the aftermath of this genocide. There is a concept that historians have developed called colonial aphasia or colonial amnesia. After this genocide, the Germans essentially forgot about this genocide that they had committed. The colonial archives, which contained the military accounts and the letters back and forth between the German government and the military, were not made available to the public. During the Third Reich, they were also kept secret. And at the end of World War II, many of these documents were carried off to Russia by the victorious Soviet soldiers. They didn't return to Germany until the 1950s. And at that time, a German historian was among the first to do research and published a book which was translated several years later into English called Let Us Die Fighting. Interestingly, he was raised in East Germany rather than West Germany, so he was raised under the communist regime. And Lenin famously said that colonialism is the height of capitalism, and that was the attitude that this man took. And so he was one of the first people to really publicly criticize German colonialism, but that wasn't until the 1960s. During the Third Reich, Hitler and his henchmen had a hope that they would be able to conquer enough of Africa that they could get their colonies back again. And it wasn't until 2004, the century anniversary of the genocide, that Germans really began to come to terms with the genocide that they had committed in Africa. If you go to Windhoek today, which I've had the opportunity to do, it's the capital of Namibia. Namibia was one of the last countries in Africa to gain its freedom. It didn't gain its freedom till 1990 because the British invaded the colony while the Germans still held it during World War II and captured the colony, and then Namibia came under the South African apartheid regime. But still standing is this very famous Ruiterdenkmal, Rider Memorial in Windhoek to memorialize the role the German soldiers played in the country. It was erected in 1912 when the Germans still controlled that colony, and it stands there still. One of the most, I think, disturbing images of the colonial era that is still carried on today is a candy called Mohrenkopf, which means the head of a Moor or the head of an African. This is what these candies look like. They are still sold in Germany. I was there doing research on my book in December last year and took this photograph at a Christmas market. These are somewhat more muted images, but the same name, the Mohrenkopf, the Moor's head, are used for these candies. A couple more things I want to mention. In my book, I devote a chapter to this man, Heinrich Witbooi. He was king of the Nama people, the second group of indigenous people who rebelled against the German military. He was educated in Africa by Lutheran missionaries, and he avoided signing one of these protection treaties for years and years, but ultimately he lost a battle and was forced to sign such a treaty, and then actually he and his men were forced to fight against the other indigenous group, the Herero, during the Battle of Waterberg. He died in battle at the age of 75 in 1905. He had the foresight to keep an archive, and we have this archive today. He kept it in a red leather notebook. He wrote in the Cape Dutch language, which he had been taught at his missionary school, and the archive contains the letters that he wrote, his journal, minutes of meetings that he had with Germans. And what's so important about this archive, which has been named a Memory of the World object by UNESCO, is that in the very act of writing, he contradicted the German perception of Africans that they were subhuman, that they had no history, no awareness of history, that they had no civilization. So his archive, which is one of the earliest things we have of that nature from Africa. This is one of the things he said in one of the letters. I see the Germans quite differently. They claim they want to protect you with these so-called treaties against other mighty nations, but it seems to me that they themselves are the mighty nation seeking to occupy our country by force. I see nothing good in the coming of the Germans. They boast of their power and they use it. And of course, this comes true for the Herero and for the Nama people. By contrast, a very famous early colonial novel written in Germany by a man named Gustav Frenssen called Peter Moore's Journey to the Southwest, or to the German colony in Southwest Africa. It is the imagined memoir of a German soldier who was part of the colonizing forces of Germans who went to Namibia. And his book valorizes the soldiers and demonstrates no empathy whatsoever for the plight of the Herero. And Frenssen significantly later becomes a very avid Nazi. He was awarded a medal by Adolf Hitler for a book he wrote later. And this book, throughout the story, emphasizes racial hierarchies and the need for Lebensraum, for living space. Here are some quotes from the novel. Both the Army chaplain and Moore's commanding officer justify the killing of the Herero and Nama in terms of racial hierarchy and religion. So his commanding officer says to him, these blacks have deserved death before God and man because they have built no houses and dug no wells. God has let us conquer here because we are the nobler and more advanced people. To the nobler and more vigorous belongs the world. That is the justice of God. I'm sorry, that was the minister who said that to the soldiers as they prepared for the Battle of Waterberg. And the commanding officer said, for a long time we must be hard and kill, but at the same time as individual men we must strive toward higher thoughts and noble deeds so that we may contribute our part to mankind. That quote, I suggest, could have been spoken by a Nazi. In conclusion, The Genocidal Gaze from German Southwest Africa to the Third Reich, the book that Susan mentioned that I have coming out next year, strives to demonstrate the deadly linkages between imperialism and genocide, between the genocide of the Herero and Nama people and that of the victims of the Holocaust, and between German colonialism in Africa and that in Eastern Europe during the Third Reich. It accomplishes this by careful reading of texts written both during colonialism and the post-colonial era. My hope in writing the book is that such a study will demonstrate the value of working at the intersection of fields of study, Holocaust studies and post-colonial studies, and more importantly, contribute to our understanding of how genocide occurs and what the warning signs are. Thank you for your attention. So I think you have the opportunity now to scribble a question on an index card, and looks like some people will come around and collect them. I'll do my best to respond to your questions.
First question is, why do you think this is an untold story?
Okay, good question, and I touched on this a little bit, but I think it's because the story of the genocide in German Southwest Africa was essentially hidden in these archives for many years. The things that were published in Germany included novels such as the Peter Moore's Journey to the Southwest, and a lot of the German military who had served in the colony came home and they wrote these glorious memoirs about how victorious they were and what a wonderful thing they had done in this colony. So I think Part of it is literally that the story was hidden, it wasn't told. Or another way to think of that is the old saying that victors get to write the history. So they wrote the history of themselves as victorious. 30 years later, Hitler comes to power, the Holocaust is committed, and there is a similar period of amnesia after the Holocaust. Interestingly, it was an American miniseries called Holocaust, which was screened in this country in 1978, that then was televised in Germany and caused the younger generation to turn to their parents and grandparents and say, "What did you do in the war?" So there was a period of a couple of decades when there was amnesia about the Holocaust. In one of my classes, I read with my students a very interesting memoir called In My Brother's Shadow by a man named Uwe Timm, whose father was a Nazi soldier. His brother was killed in battle as a Nazi soldier. And he talks about growing up in Germany and never hearing a word about what had happened in the war or about the Holocaust. So I think those are some of the contributing factors as to why this hasn't been much told.
To what extent were blacks from Africa brought back to Germany, and did this help spark more racial theories and rules?
Okay. Also a very interesting question. The Germans really didn't have much interest in bringing Africans to the country, to the fatherland. Occasionally, Africans were brought and made part of what were called colonial expositions, which were essentially kind of like museums where Africans were forced, often behind glass, to live in the environment of a reconstructed colonial village. And they lived in these colonial exposition fake villages 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Germans would come as if they were going to a museum and watch the Africans eat their meals and sleep in their huts and so forth. So there was some transferal of Africans. And interestingly, I just read an article that said that these colonial shows continued even a little bit into the Third Reich. And then finally Hitler said, no, we're not going to have these performances anymore. I'd like to just mention briefly that other European powers are not exempt from these kinds of horrendous treatments of the indigenous people in their colonies. Probably most infamous would be King Leopold of Belgium, who committed a genocide in what was called the Belgian Congo. And other colonizers used forced labor techniques and so forth. But the slide I showed you about why German colonialism is unique is widely accepted, that some of their excesses were the worst of the excesses. But some of the other colonies did welcome Africans into their community more readily than the Germans did.
Has Germany currently or in the past paid reparations to the families of the victims? And if not, have there been efforts to make this happen?
Okay. Also a really great question. Germany has not paid reparations, nor did they even apologize to the Herero and Nama families who are descendants of the people who barely survived until 2004. 100 years after the genocide, when it wasn't the leader of Germany, but one of the secretaries of something or other who was sent to today's Namibia to make an apology. There have been requests from the indigenous people in Namibia for reparations because much of the land that they owned is still owned by descendants of Germans who wrested the land from the indigenous people who had been killed or died as forced laborers or sex slaves. And their generations of their family have maintained these enormous plantations in Namibia. And so the Germans felt the indigenous people felt that they deserved to have reparations. They even eventually sued through an American court in an effort to get Germany to pay reparations, but to date that has not happened.
What were the roles of the missionaries who were educating or ministering to the Africans in Namibia in permitting the genocide? And was this non-interference by the missionaries continued through the 1919 to 1945 era?
The German missionaries preceded the colonizers, so they had been on the ground in Africa before it became a German colony from about the 1840s on. Majority were Lutheran ministers, since that's one of the majority religions in Germany still today. There were Catholic missionaries there as well. It's hard to generalize about them because some of them were profoundly shocked at what the military did, and others collaborated with the military. And one of the most notable instances of that collaboration is after the Battle of Waterberg, when the missionaries were actively involved with the military in trying to encourage the people starving in the desert, the remnant of the Herero people, to come back in. The missionaries made promises to these people about what their lives would be like. These promises were not kept, and people were forced into camps and into hard labor without any compensation. Just as an example, I mean, we know that one of the things the Nazis did was to calculate how many calories a human being needs in order to survive from day to day. And then they would deliver to the Jews who were enclosed in ghettos and unable to get food in any other way but through the deliveries. They would calculate less calories than what people in the ghetto needed in order to survive. It was seen as saving bullets. That is to say, people would die from disease or starvation, and therefore the Germans would have saved bullets. And this philosophy was already in place in the labor camps and the death camp in Namibia. For example, rice is not a staple of the diet of Herero and Nama people. They subsist largely on the cattle that they grow. Much of Namibia is desert, so it's not really advantageous for growing food. And so their cattle were their money, were their meat, and were their milk. And they would not be able to have access to their cattle when they were in these concentration camps and the death camp, Shark Island. And so the Germans would give them a little cup of uncooked rice, and that would be all they would be given to eat. But they had no pots and pans, and they didn't really know what to do with rice. It wasn't a kind of food that they had available to them, and hence the widespread starvation.
How is this ethnic cleansing or genocide in Namibia remembered today? Are there memorials or museums like, what you would find in Germany, Holocaust, or around the world?
Another great question, thank you. For a very long time, there were no memorials, and another chapter of my book is devoted to a sculptor and artist named William Kentridge, who is a Jewish South African artist. His family came from the Lithuanian shtetls 2 generations before him. Both his parents were anti-apartheid lawyers, and he has created a 22-minute art installation called Black Box, which is a beautiful memorial. in order to do research for this art installation, he went to the site where the Battle of Waterberg has taken place. Though I've been to Namibia, I didn't get to go to that site. He recounts in interviews the memorials that are at the site for German soldiers, but there's no memorial there for the Herero people who died. The present-day Namibians have created outside the capital of Windhoek a large memorial called Heroes Acre, which has statues and gravestones, but of course the graves are empty. And the memorial is actually quite controversial because it was designed and built by Koreans. So a lot of the Namibian people have been unable to embrace this memorial. Curiously, there's a very similar memorial on top of a hill, an enormous statue of an African man and woman and child in Senegal that I've had the opportunity to see. It was built by the president of Senegal, and it was designed and built by Koreans, and it has also been reviled. The memoir that I mentioned by the contemporary German author Uwe Timm, In My Brother's Shadow, did generate a lot of interest in Namibia, and it specifically made the Namibian people go back and read his novel Morenga, and it has meant that Morenga, who was another indigenous revolutionary hero in these wars, he has now become a national hero and is recognized, but it's been a long time coming. The Germans still control much of Namibia. The German language is heard frequently in certain towns, particularly Windhoek and Swakopmund, and a lot of German customs are still in place in bars and hotels and so forth. So the indigenous people have had a very rough go of it in the last 100 years.
Given the information that's known about now, the genocide in German South Africa, or Namibia, does that lead scholars to feel that the Holocaust was more premeditated? Or do you feel that it was something manifested due to the rise of the Nazis in the 30s?
Also an interesting question. As I mentioned at the outset of my talk, I don't think that the genocide in Namibia was the cause of the Nazi Holocaust in any way. We know the major causes were the long history of anti-Semitism that certainly existed before the Third Reich, but finds its growth under Hitler's leadership. Hitler himself, the economic difficulties that the country was experiencing, the embrace of the science of eugenics, which was, again, not exclusively German. This country also embraced the ideology of eugenics. And European imperialism has to be counted as one of the things that influenced the German population. I think the fact that the military conducted this genocide and that it is written about in glowing terms, in literary texts, in newspaper columns. Postcards are sent back by German soldiers to their families. And these are postcards of, as I mentioned, the skulls, of people being whipped, of people being hung. I mean, these are horrifying images that are sent back. I would add that when lynching was prevalent in the American South, similar postcards were made and sent by white families to their relatives elsewhere. So I would say that it is more that the genocide in Southwest Africa prepares the minds of the Germans to accept the idea of genocide, to accept the idea of racial hierarchies where the master race, the Aryan race, is at the top, and indigenous people or Jews are at the bottom. The idea that somehow you could have an Endlösung, a final solution, that it was okay to cleanse certain lands and areas of certain people, had been practiced in Namibia, and it had been conveyed to the German people, and so there was a kind of readiness. So I wouldn't say that it was premeditated on the basis of the colonial wars. For one thing, to some extent, as I've mentioned, the details of that genocide in the colony were hidden in archives, but the ideology behind it and the methodology, the use of death camps, the use of medical experimentation, the philosophy of Lebensraum, all of these things contributed to, I think, it being easier for Hitler to do what he did than it might have been otherwise.
What is the difference between text written during colonialism and the post-Holocaust era?
I gave you examples of two texts that were written, one by an indigenous Nama man and the other by a German man, Gustav Frentzen. And I've mentioned also the Uwe Timm text, which is a post-Holocaust text in which he is attempting to come to terms with what Germany did. Interestingly, his colonial novel, Marenga, was published in 1978 at a time when Germans knew relatively little about this genocide. And it's a critique of Germany's military behavior, a very explicit critique. He waits 25 years to write the memoir about his father and brother, in part because he didn't want to write the memoir when his parents were alive. In the post-Holocaust era, I think we have had a much, thank goodness, greater recognition of what the Germans did and of the need to critique, to give warnings against genocide. In the aftermath, the Germans created a word, Vergangenheitsbewältigung. They like to keep their language pure, like their race, and so when they need a new word, they put together 2 or 3 existing German words, and this word, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, means, part of the word means the past, history, and part of the word means coming to terms with or coping with. And it was a word that the Germans created specifically for the process of coming to terms with the Holocaust, of how is a society in the aftermath of what happened going to make reparations, going to build memorials, going to change the government, going to change laws, all of the things that a society needs to do in the post-genocide or post-Holocaust era. And so I think I would say that the Germans have done certainly a better job of Vergangenheitsbewältigung in the post-Holocaust era than they did in the post-colonial era. In fact, had there been more widespread critique of the genocide they committed in Africa, it might have been a major deterrent to Hitler.
I want to first thank you, the audience, for your excellent questions. I want to thank you that I didn't have to pronounce that word in German. It would have been a long night. This was really an excellent, excellent lecture about something that I knew nothing or very little about until, frankly, I looked before the lecture online to see and was so surprised that, you know, having spent so much time involved in learning about the Holocaust, that I did not know anything about this. So I think this was incredibly enlightening, and I think for all of us this evening, very well delivered, and we really thank you very, very much, Dr. Baer, for everything that you said tonight and all of your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.